Welcome everyone to another episode of Wine and Markets with Dan and Cam. I'm your host Daniel Cernoski. I'm here with Cameron Kirko as well, and today we'll be covering another episode, I guess, looking at recessions, looking at, I guess, what happened with markets last year, and then obviously looking at some of the consensus that we're seeing in markets. Now, just from a disclaimer's point of view, this is everything that you hear today is our own opinions, and if you have an interest in investing, please seek professional advice.
Correct.
Great.
Okay, so just to cover over what we're starting with on the wine front, we had two wines originally, then one of them was corked, and so that basically means because it doesn't have a screw cap closure, some air gets in, and it basically turns the wine in vinegary, which means it sucks.
Well, I kept on thinking Cam was saying cooked, and I was like, yeah, the wine's cooked. It's terrible. And he's like, no, corked.
Yeah, wine can also be cooked as well, but then it doesn't actually have it's flavourless, and which is also sad.
So I was right.
You were.
Yeah.
So in terms of the wines that we are actually going to talk about, so just to quickly, this is the corked one, sad face.
And that is
a 2016 Semillon from Bordeaux, but they can't put that on the label because it was made a bit differently.
Correct.
This is the other one, which is, believe it or not, this is also a white wine. It's just left on its skins while the grapes are fermenting. And so
what was that one?
That is the Hoddles Creek Skins.
The Hoddles Creek Skins. It's funny because that, for everyone, I guess, listening on the podcast, it's weird. It's a white wine, but it looks like a red wine.
And it tastes more like a red wine as well.
Yeah, it's really weird.
Yeah, it's designed to mess up with your head, basically.
And the last one, do you want to introduce it?
Yeah.
Is a Cullen Wines late harvest. So it's more of a sweeter type of wine. It's I'm gonna butcher the name.
It's a dessert wine. Oh, Chenin Blanc.
Chenin Blanc. I kept on calling it Chenin Blanc. I
Yeah.
can't believe it, but yeah, Chenin Blanc.
We learn new languages as we
all the time,
drink wine.
and I keep on making those mistakes. But hey, it tastes good, and I absolutely enjoyed it when we were in the Margaret River.
Yes, last year. Gosh, time flies.
Time flies. Great. Well, I think Cam, maybe let's start and open it up at least with the first wine.
Yep.
We'll talk about then. We'll lead into a little bit more on the market front.
Yep.
And then I can end it with the late harvest from Cullen Wines.
Okay, so Pinot Gris, or you might have heard it called Pinot Grigio, can make very boring, tame wines. But what happens when the winemakers leave it on the skins? It changes the colour, it changes the flavour, and it also adds tannin as well. So what I mean by that is, like, as you're drinking it, as you're sipping it, there's this grip on your tongue that when it's a simple white wine just isn't there, but the flavour profile also changes. So this has a bit more like strawberry spice sort of
and
thing
it looks
going.
it looks like almost like
gold.
rose gold, or
Yeah.
like even like a very light vinegar colour.
Yeah.
Like
Potentially like a light red.
a very, very light red.
Yeah, like a rosé.
Rosé, yes,
Yeah.
that's probably it. Yeah, that's right.
But it's not. It's actually a white wine. This is a style that's sort of really well known in Italy originally, and we've seen increasingly a bunch of Australian producers that want to make something with a bit more oomph, give the grape this kind of treatment, and it's the style of Pinot Gris I personally prefer because it's just a lot more interesting. I find the other ones tend to be a bit blander, and the other reason I like it, with skin contact, it makes the wine a bit more versatile food-wise. So something like this I could actually have with some light meat dishes, whereas if it's a simple Pinot Gris or Pinot Grigio, I don't think it necessarily works as well.
Yeah.
But it's a personal preference as well, because this makes it, it's not as fruity. Like, there's fruit there, but it's definitely more savoury.
I would say it's growing on me.
Yeah.
At first, I thought, no, this is not it. Also, I probably shouldn't have had the sweet wine before I tried this wine. But it's actually not bad.
Yeah. It's very different though.
It's different.
Yeah.
But it's also, it's not, even the palate, like, you know, when there's a harshness to it. There is no harshness to it.
No.
It's actually quite soft.
Yeah, and the guys that make this Hoddles Creek, they make some of the best value Chardonnay and Pinot out of Yarra Valley. Their Pinot Gris, the standard one's also really good. It's not as dark as this. This is kind of like a special project, but definitely well worth seeking out their wines. And I think the 22s will probably be out in another month or two as well.
Yeah, good Victorian wine.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe over to you for the Chenin Blanc.
Oh, yes. We'll cover that net. We'll cover that towards the end. But the corked wine. What was it meant to be? I guess is the question. This was your choice.
Yeah, it was, and I was a bit sad it wasn't there. So this one is 100% Semillon, which some of you might know from the Hunter Valley, but it's actually from Bordeaux. And so what this wine was meant to taste like, based on Insta tasting notes I found, was more sort of like toffee and marshmallow and stuff. And I think you get some of that, how it smells a little bit. Like it's got this sweetness to the smell, but then just on the palate, it's unfortunately just a real letdown.
Well, I called it as vinegary, and you were shocked when I said that. But
but no, like
it was okay. It was slightly bearable with some cheese.
Yeah, but it's
then
not.
It turned unbearable.
It shouldn't. It shouldn't need that. On its own, it should be sort of like, explosion of flavors, because this is nearly 7 years old now as well. It's a 2016 vintage, but unfortunately that happens, and it's just something to be conscious of. And this is, when you think about it, this is a reason why if you're in a restaurant, they pour someone that first sip to taste the wine. It's usually because it's got a cork in it. There's actually a risk that, unfortunately, this happens.
Have you ever been? This is a question because I'm curious now. Have you ever been? When I'm sorry, but it's true. And you see someone doing it, and no one knows what the hell it's for.
Yeah.
And like you're the first person to order it. Like you've chosen the wine, they pour it in your glass only just to taste it, just to check if it is corked, and that's the term. Have you ever returned something? That's the question.
I have.
You've been one of those people?
Not at a restaurant, but at a wine bar, at a bar, I should say, near my office. There was I think it was a Barossa Barbera, believe it or not, which is this Italian grape variety. But I think they'd had the bottle open for too long. And so I was sipping it, and I'm like, this isn't right. This isn't what it should taste like. And I was sipping a little bit more, and then I'm like, nah, screw that. And I went up to the bar and asked the guy, and he was a bit surprised, but then he smelled it and he's like, oh yeah, oops. And so he opened a new bottle and gave me a glass.
Wow.
So
because I've always been laughed at for trying and actually,
No, it's definitely, so look, simple rules is like, the wine should not taste like vinegar.
Yes.
It should have a bit of fruit of some shape or form, differs depending on if it's white or red. But if it smells a bit funky or the taste is a bit off, unless it's some sort of really weird and wacky natural wine thing, in which case it could also be corked, because there's plenty of those that are on the fringe of being commercially acceptable, based on what I've tried anyway. You should actually not be afraid to just ask for them to open a fresh bottle. And,
be calm and be that person that tells them it's wrong.
I'm
just joking. I'm just joking. Especially if you're paying that much.
No, but just even if you're having a glass and it's off.
That's true. Okay.
Right?
No, it's just curious because I've been meaning to ask that question because it's interesting. I don't think I've ever sent something back.
Yeah, I mean, I was out for a mate's birthday last night, and the wine that they gave me the wine to try, and one thing I should have done that I didn't, the wine itself was okay, but what I should have asked is that it was a red wine, I should have asked them to put it on ice. Because wherever they'd stored it, it was a bit too warm, and that's just something to be aware of, particularly if you're in Australia, like your red and white temperatures should be a bit closer together than they normally
Well,
are.
technically, to be honest,
Yeah.
it's funny because we talked about this a while back. 14 to 15 degrees is good cellaring, and that's a cool cellar.
Yeah.
That's probably what wine should be
Served
opened
at,
at and served at. And then so that if it does change in temperature, it's changing and maturing in your glass.
Yeah. It'll open up, and it'll change from 14 to towards room temperature fairly quickly as well. But it's just something to be aware of, particularly for your reds. Like I find typically most people just toss their whites in the fridge probably for a bit too long, because what I find is if you cool the white wine for too long, you lose sort of a lot of the different aspects of the
when we're
flavour.
talking about cooling, it's not 14, we're talking about really cold.
Fridge cold, like 3-4 degrees, right?
Cool.
Yeah.
No, that's good. That's good. Well, that was at least the first wine, and we've obviously discussed the corked wine, or as I said, the cooked one.
Yes.
Great. Now, I guess it's good to be back. That's one. I know we said we're going to do a little bit more regular in terms of regular type of podcast, but we will be doing it now. Last year was a bit crazy, but we've gotten there, and we're really keen to sort of continue this on. And the feedback actually has been really good. So can't complain there, and we're really keen to sort of kickstart this off again. And really, to kickstart it off, it's March now. Looking at the year that was last year, it was a bit of a surprise. We saw Europe, which everyone was expecting it to be much worse than what it was. It wasn't. Didn't have a really harsh winter. It had a very mild winter, which was great. For I guess from a perspective of markets were oversold in Europe, and that really surprised on the upside. You had the China reopen happen as well towards the end of the year, to even the start of the year. And on top of that, we looked at even the Australian markets did extremely well in comparison. So that was really interesting to see. There was a lot of shocks, I guess. And I guess the most surprising thing that I saw, and we talked about this even before, if you look at January, you had value and you had growth do well. And when we're talking about value and growth, the types of styles of stocks, we talk about value stocks is your traditional type of companies with cash flows established, dividends, things like that. And then you have growth companies that are tech based, or that sit in the consumer.
There's more optimism. Like they're expected to grow much faster.
Like your Netflix and whatnot. And essentially you saw where they shouldn't have, but they did well together. And actually, if you look at the growth value splits, they've actually been moving in the same direction. There hasn't been much, I guess, divergence between them. And when we're looking at that, and it's like, okay, well, I can understand cyclical value, because quality actually didn't do as good as what it was expected it to do. I think it's still yet to play out. I think the quality aspect on both sides, growth and value. So quality companies, strong balance sheets, strong credentials of the company's overall finances. That's what we're talking about. Quality, they're still not there yet.
Yeah, but it was also a bit of a junk rally, though, right? Like a lot of the stuff that copped it in the teeth last year was just bouncing off some low points. Like what Tesla's not quite double,
that's
but
been a
it's
roller
like
coaster.
70% for calendar year to date.
Salesforce the other day or so, insane increases. It's been interesting.
It's been a wild ride.
And you're looking at it and you're just like, wow. But really, all it showed from a portfolio perspective is diversification is still king.
It is.
It really is. And maybe let's not complicate things. It's just, I've had a look at this and just like, if you've got good quality, if you're doing investment managers, that's great. And if you've got good quality investments underlying, well, that's fine as well. And there's a lot of noise in between. So I thought that was quite interesting to sort of see. That what we noticed over probably the last year and a little bit outside of that as well, leading up until March.
I think, for me personally, I was surprised by the extent of the rally. And not just that, like for some names where I'm like, let's talk about Australia specifically. I'm like, mortgage rates have just like skyrocketed in the space of less than a year. I'm like, surely households are going to start, pushing back, like, and lowering their spending. And it took a while, but we finally started to see some signs of it. So, a bunch of the consumer discretionary names have gotten sold off on reporting season decently as well.
Yes, and it's affected some managers who have been heavy on that space.
Yeah.
But this is an interesting sort of point of view because it's all predicated on interest rates, okay? And some markets are more sensitive than others. You have, and this is just bringing it back down to the interest rate environment in general. You have the United States, okay, because that's a big one that's talked about. The United States, the Fed has been increasing, probably will continue to increase because spending hasn't really leveled off as much as they expected it to. There's been
inflation slowing, but it's still at a very high level.
Correct. Yeah. Now, but their mortgages in the United States are fixed for 30 years.
Yeah.
That's the difference. When you look at Australia, you look at New Zealand, New Zealand's an interesting case.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Canada, the UK, at least Australia, Canada, the UK.
Yeah.
It's mostly variable.
Sweden too. Actually.
Sweden as well. That's some of the Scandinavians. It's all mostly variable. So actually increasing interest rates does affect household spending.
It does. Yeah.
And also, but it also means that the housing market is at risk. So that means that markets can look forward and do better because they're pricing in, or the central banks in those countries can't really continue raising rates without crushing the economy and the housing market. Yeah. And if they crush it too hard, well, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a bigger problem.
And I guess the one saving grace to all that is just the backlog of work that has been created. Like if we take Australia, right, we had the home builder policy under the previous government that was trying to encourage people to basically spend on resi property, whether in renovations or new developments. And that created it helped create inflation, great, but it also created like quite a big backlog of work for the construction sector, which is a massive employer for the Australian economy, right? And that is still going to help support the sector in the near term, but the concern is just where building approvals are going, where housing financing is going as well. We saw yesterday, actually, the ABS updated its sort of like new mortgage issuance stats, and that's still cratering. Like it hasn't. It's still going like this. It hasn't inflected up, and I think it's actually the worst year-on-year growth in its history, if I'm not too wrong. Like the previous month, the GFC was worse, but I think we're either there or close to sort of like the worst decline in new credit growth. And you're also seeing that just amongst the banks, like they're throwing money around left and right. Because you're seeing a lot of people refinancing as fixed rates roll off, and it's really, I think the only people that are doing well out of all this are probably people that can get a good deal and the mortgage brokers, to be honest with you.
And bringing it back to, I thought we looked at New Zealand as well, and you were sort of stating that a lot of it has been, they have that viewpoint of having things fixed for 2 years.
Yeah.
And then when that rolls off, even the fixed stuff in Australia is rolling off between April and November this year.
Most of it.
Yeah. And that's the 2% or under 2% to almost 5-ish.
5, 6, depending on the
year issue. So that's massive.
Yeah.
But you're saying in New Zealand it's a bit different, but I assumed it was going to be very similar.
Their market, so this is what I got told by someone else, but my understanding is in New Zealand the standard rate, just because of the way their market operates, isn't actually variable. It's typically a 2-year fixed rate. There are some issuers that are trying to change the market mentality,
right,
but that's been a bit slow going. That might change going forward. But the important takeaway though for all these countries Dan mentioned, it's like, yeah, you've got this window where fixed rates are basically shielding households from rise in mortgage rates, but outside of the US, that window is rapidly shutting. And so then the question is like, how much have households in aggregate been, prudent and saved away all that money, or how much have households just spent it?
We looked at some of the savings rates
Yeah.
and compared it to the new issuance of credit cards in the US.
Okay.
And it's been fascinating because the saving rates have plummeted to levels lower than what they were before COVID. Before COVID, mind you.
Yeah.
And new credit card issuance or credit has skyrocketed to a level around where the GFC was.
Yeah.
So that's massive divergence there.
It's not too surprising.
So really people have gone from having savings to support, and I don't know how much of this data also is reliable, because you're looking at also, well, what is the average incomes of those households? What does that look like? Where has that savings gone? Has it actually been spent, or has it gone elsewhere?
Yeah,
we don't know.
It's in whose hands is the savings. So look, reality is if you're someone whose net worth is north of a couple of mil, like having an extra 20k thrown at you, like you're probably going to hive that away into cash or financial assets. Like you're not necessarily going to take that 20k and go, I'm going to go spend this.
No,
right?
That's right.
So where the savings are actually located is actually really important for how much impact they have on the economy. If they basically go towards sort of more concentrated on the top end of town, let's say hypothetically, then the actual economic impact is going to be a lot less because that segment doesn't spend as much.
And did you want to, I guess, just so for those, a lot of people understand what inflation is, but maybe just explaining inflation in layman's terms.
Okay.
And I'm throwing this one out.
No, sure.
Because I'm going to go into the whole disinflation, deflation, and what we mean by those.
The way it's done in Australia, and there's two ways inflation's calculated. So broadly speaking, the ABS estimates looks at household spending and estimates a basket of goods, if you will, goods and services, I should say. Importantly, that does not include the price of existing property. So it only includes the cost of new builds and rent. So that's one thing where it's a bit different to the reality facing a lot of households. So that's one point to note. The other point to note is that basket changes over time. So what it was estimated to be last year is quite different to, say, 20, 30 years ago, right? So the composition of our measure of inflation shifts. Because
what they're looking at, what they're calculating as.
People spend money on different stuff, right?
And it changes over the decades.
And the other thing to note is what people like the RBA care about, or at least should be focusing on, is what they call underlying measures of inflation. And so within that basket of goods and services I consume, some things tend to be a lot more volatile in terms of their prices. And so the RBA and other central banks are like, okay, let's strip out some of these things that, there's a drought somewhere in Australia, so that's boosted food prices. Okay, let's strip out those impacts and say, for the rest of the basket, what are prices actually doing? Are they going up too quickly, or they're going down too quickly? Like, what's going on? And in simple terms, if they're going up too quickly, they're going to be a bit more biased towards hiking interest rates. But the other point I should know, and I was explaining this to some juniors earlier this week, is the RBA actually has two mandates. So inflation's only one of them, and the other one is actually maintaining full employment in the Australian economy. And technically there's a third one about currency stability, which typically they don't focus on.
Takes a back seat.
Yeah, but usually what the RBA, I would say, was doing for 2020 to early 22 was basically like, oh shit, the economy, so pardon my French, the economy's taken a bit of a hit, and like, damn guys, we need to support, we need to keep rates low.
Yep.
We'll give cheap funding to the banks, which we all got to enjoy with lower fixed rates, and that's what our job is here and now. So it went from that to, oh crap guys, inflation looks a bit more embedded than we thought. We need to hike rates quite drastically to bring inflation back to our ideal target of 2 to 3%.
Gotcha. No, that's good. And essentially, when we're looking at there's two other terms used here. You got inflation that has been increasing. You have disinflation. And what we mean by disinflation, and this is what's happening now in the US, there is disinflation. So all is inflation, the rate of inflation is slowing, coming off. That's what we mean by that. Deflation is when it's more negative, in the negative sort of territory. And that's not a good thing either, because all that is people selling goods and lowering their prices just for the sake of sales.
Yeah.
And that creates other fundamental problems. So it's an interesting sort of concept to look at. And it really sort of puts us into this category of, okay, recession. You know, that seems to be the topic that was discussed, you know, or looked at towards the end of last year. What will a recessionary term look like? And really, this whole concept of soft landing and hard landing. All that really is how intense is a recessionary environment going to be like? You know, in a hard landing, it's probably quite intense. We're looking at something it will affect people, markets, the whole like. That's what we mean by a hard landing. Soft landing is the severity, so soft landing is much less, or it gets maintained where interest rates have risen, inflation moves downwards to an acceptable level, but potentially structural, so maintained at higher levels. But the interest rate rises don't affect or don't necessarily destroy the economy.
Yeah, so economic growth slows.
Correct.
But we don't see enough damage to trigger an overall recession.
Like an unemployment going up and the like.
Yeah, but importantly, that might be true for the overall economy, but not for certain sectors. So if
Correct.
we were to look at the US in sort of that 2015-16 period, technically some parts of the country were in there was a manufacturing recession, but the US overall managed to dodge it.
Yep. Yeah. And you know, the Wall Street bankers have come up with a new term, which I was told is a no landing. So that's an interesting one as well. We just continually roll off and continue rolling on to a lower for longer world as what we were before COVID.
So it's important, before we go on that tangent, it's just important to note that what people are doing, Wall Street, people like us, like, we're trying to say, okay, here are all these data points, here are what share prices, bond prices are all doing, and we're trying to craft a narrative that can help explain it for you. And if we're really clever and we're trying to sell headlines, we craft it with a nice title as well. That doesn't mean it's actually true.
I like good stories, Cam.
Yeah,
you know, I like
telling
good stories.
I love stories too, but it's just important. It's just important to understand.
Yes, that's right.
People
100%.
are trying to sort of explain and encapsulate
to their house view what they think based on everything that they've seen, based on all the indicators. And look at the indicators; it is signalling a recession in the next couple of years.
Yes,
whether it be
a lot of
end of this year, early next year, or end of or mid next year. It's hard to sort of say. Because remember, every interest rate rise, and mind you, the amount of interest rate rises, we haven't seen how fast. It's not necessarily the levels of where the interest rates are sitting at. It's how fast we've gotten from one point to another. That is the concern. Because and it was a great analogy. So I've used the analogy of every interest rate rise is like if you press the brakes on a car, it'll eventually stop. Take some time to stop, like the economy. Another great one, which I absolutely love, is think of every interest rate, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this before, as a shot glass, a shot of tequila. If you continually have one every minute, constantly, You're not going to be drunk in the first
Yeah.
couple. It might take it half an
Yeah.
hour to an hour, and then it hits you. That's what every interest. We're only going to see the effects of the first interest rate rise towards the end of this year. Okay, so if we're seeing the first interest rate rise from last year, because it takes 12 to 18 months to filter through the economy, if we're going to see the first one towards what, November, give or take,
Yeah.
this year, November
yeah,
to
yeah.
2024,
Yeah.
November 23 to Jan or March 24, that's a long way to see what the effects have been. And if the RBA and other central banks continue to hike, well, have they overdone it or have they underdone it? And this is where the soft and hard landing sort of question comes into, or no lending, which is another weird fact. And
I mean, if you look at like just to have they overdone it already is actually a question.
Yeah,
Like, if you look
a
at,
fair point.
I mean, this has been a bit cheeky, but if you look at the Australian
We like
growth
being
numbers for the December quarter, if you strip out sort of the net exports component, the economy actually shrank. Like,
And supply in general, supply chains have fallen, and
the supply chain disruption. Yeah.
disruption. Sorry, but what I'm talking about is demand. Sorry,
Yeah,
demand.
the demand
has
side.
fallen.
So,
If you look at shipping containers, the price of a shipping container has come off massively to levels under what it was before COVID.
yeah,
You got used car sales coming down. Another indicator that demand is slowly shifting back to levels where lower levels than what it was in the historical norm. It's really fascinating.
fascinating and worrying too.
At the same time, it is.
Yeah, and we're starting to see signs of weakness. Like, I mean, I tend to focus on Australia because it's close to home, but
I like looking at everything.
Yeah, no, but
I'm that type of person.
But yeah, you've seen it might be a one-off, but the unemployment rate actually kicked up a notch for the month of January. Retail sales, if you strip out price effects, have been flat or negative for the last 2 quarters as well.
But in saying all this, bad news is actually good news. And hear me out with this one. So every time we get a bad news number economically, unemployment is going up. Yes, that's bad. Demand is coming off, potentially bad, slowing economy. All that signifies to me is, hey, if we're seeing it, central banks are seeing it, and maybe they'll pivot and start turning the interest rates the other way, turning them off. And markets will absolutely love that.
Yeah, that is...
Bonds will do really well.
Yeah, that is the great hope, I would say. Well, no, I mean, it's nice if that's true. Why are we even talking about this? It's fine. They've got our back. But the concern is, historically speaking, they don't tend to do it in time. They
stuff up. Yeah, and we get a double recession.
Inflicted too much damage, and then it's not a fun scenario, so to speak.
No, that's right. And I guess the other aspect that we haven't spoken about really has been the China reopen. Now, we had a bit of a
discussion,
disagreement, to say the least. But this happens. This happens. Is the reopen inflationary for the world or deflationary?
Yeah.
I think, in the short run, is inflationary. They are at the period where we were a year or two ago.
Yeah. And I would say, the classic economist answer, it depends.
Oh, God.
Well, because part of the argument for why it should be inflationary is, the government's going to stimulate to help support the economy out of all this. And that's actually something we don't know yet. Like, reality is people are speculating and guessing, and that's why you've seen some of the iron ore miners race up to what I think are stupid prices, because they think, government's going to turn on the tap, boys. We're going to be shipping as much iron ore as we want to China, and iron ore to the moon, basically. I think
the Australian budgetary situation.
Well, yes, very
back
much
to
so.
surplus potentially.
Yeah.
Anyway,
But yeah, it really depends. And what I would say about China and the inflation argument, I think there is some truth to it. Like, you're going from a scenario where you've trapped all these people functionally in the one country for, a couple of a year, 2 years, to one where, damn, they can actually move now. So certain things, and you've seen it, like with Chinese New Year, like air travel and that surged, and all the rest of it. So I think you are going to see some inflationary impulses in certain sectors. I don't think you're going to see as strong an impulse, like an inflationary upswing as we've seen in the West. And part of the reason for that is, like, compared to Western countries, it's almost like, I don't want to say like Chinese authorities don't give a stuff about their households, but yeah, they don't give a stuff about their households in a sense. So they, compared to what the US
I disagree.
did, what we did.
You know why?
Okay.
Just hear me out here.
All right.
So, and the reason why I think, okay, what has been the reason or the mandate, or I guess you have the Communist Party in China. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, they know for a fact that keeping a population happy has been, and the trick has been, we're happy for you to govern the way you're governing, but make sure living standards continue to rise. And you know what? They've done a good job in lifting those living standards. They have. But yes, you can argue that there's whole other reasons why, but if you look at where living standards were before, in the 60s compared to now, there's a big difference. That's all I'm looking at. I'm not looking at anything historical or anything like that, or the difficulties they've had until they got to this stage and what they had to go through and what people had to go through. Now, they know that is important, so they would need to stimulate, but also they're not problem free. The housing market is, there's a problem with the housing market over there. There's a problem with developers over there. State-owned entities, there's a problem over there with that. Government's trying to figure it all out, and they might be forced to stimulate to firstly maintain living standards, keep the people happy, and that may be, and probably is, or could be, inflationary. And where they were exporting deflation, they might, in the short run, exploit inflation. I think that's all I'm getting at.
I understand that. The thing is, I just think it's very complicated, and I think people will bet their money in different ways based on their worldviews. So one is not so much that they're going to be supporting households, it's they're going to go back to their old growth model, which is to pump as much money as they can towards supporting building property and other kinds of infrastructure assets.
Could be.
In which case, great for Aussie iron ore. Happy
to
days.
a degree, because now there's a few mines that have opened up in Africa that Chinese
but those aren't going to be operational at scale for a few years yet. So
we've got a few years.
We'll be right.
Hopefully. Yep.
That's more of a longer term risk.
But we can't rely on that. I think that's the other thing.
Yeah. But this is the thing. Like, China is very complicated.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, none of us can 100% rely on their stats either. So it does make it difficult to gauge where the economy's heading. It's definitely showing signs of improvement, which is quite constructive. But yeah, for me personally, I think that the jury's still out on a number of factors. And I also think I think their growth model of just pumping and building more property and everything else, I think if it's not quite derailed, it's definitely not going to be as big a boost. And you've kind of seen this just in the official Chinese growth. It's like, everyone's like, oh, China, that's so great. Look at them, they're growing 6-7% per annum
every year.
Well, look at what the official growth numbers are at now. They're not 6 or 7%. They've come back a lot. And then, if you even quibble with those, reality is probably even a bit lower with the COVID lockdowns and everything else. I personally think the China reopening could actually be I think it depends. I think in some sectors it'll be inflationary because people can get out and there'll be a surge in demand for what we've seen in the Western world. Like people want to travel, they want to get out, and the airlines have been making a killing, right? So I think some sectors, happy days. Others, I think it might actually be sort of helping ease supply chains because some companies it would have been difficult to get access to labour and ensure stuff got delivered on time. So in that sense, I could actually see it being a deflationary impulse as well.
Ideally, it goes back to we'll see. And what I mean by that is, and I have to explain this little story. I'm all about the stories. Or a tale, I guess. And I was told that it might have been also a Chinese tale, actually. Back in the day, but also I've heard it in Europe as well. So maybe it's got mixture in both sort of regions. But essentially, a wise old man, looking at a village, and a child receives a horse, and the villagers go, "Oh, how wonderful!"
Yeah.
The child has a horse, where the rest of the kids don't, and he goes, "We'll see." And then the child falls off the horse, the young boy, falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And they're, "Oh, how terrible, he's broken his leg." And he goes, "Oh, we'll see." And then essentially the villagers go to war, and essentially he goes, "Oh, that he couldn't get conscripted." So they go, "Oh, that's wonderful, like he didn't have to go to war." And he goes, we'll see. So a lot of this thing is, we will see. We don't know. What China does, what the whole sort of aspect really going forward really is. But anyway, sorry, one of my favourite tales, a little bit on a tangent, but I thought I'll explain it because it's true.
Yeah.
We don't know. No one knows. And a lot of the consensus has been wrong.
Yeah. And that's just important. Like, just be skeptical of some of the stories you hear as well.
And make up your own conclusion. Now, I know we haven't talked about the last wine. And I really wanted to talk about this because, again,
the stage.
I know I do have the stage, and I'm super excited. It's the Cullen wine, Margaret River. You can say it.
Chenin Blanc.
Chenin Blanc. There you go. And it is a 2021 late harvest. It's called. Now, I love this because Cullen wines, and I have to bring my ESG scope to this because I absolutely love the topic. Has been it's actually to 2021, and this is a fun fact, 50 years of sustainable growing in 2001. And this 2001 that we're actually drinking, it actually it's cane cut, hand picked on the 26th of March by a biodynamic mosh fruit on the mosh fruit day. So the last day of the harvest. So what Cullen wine does really, really interesting, and I love this fact, they pick their wines based on the moon, where the moon is positioned. Yeah. So if it's not right and not positioned like a full moon, there are certain grapes that are picked for certain wines. And they believe that wines need to be picked in certain periods on certain days. So this is why it's really fascinating. It's such a great way of looking at things. And they also put in cow horns into the ground.
Yes, and what are those cow horns filled with, Dan?
I knew you were going to ask me this. They're filled with cow manure.
I don't know if it's necessarily cow manure, but definitely manure to help, because the idea is the horn itself will degrade in the soil and it'll release the nutrients from the manure. It's a bit graphic, but I think the thing about it is these guys, they follow organic principles.
Correct.
So they really reduce, I don't think they use any really recognised pesticides or the like.
None.
And they follow a biodynamic approach as well, which Dan was just outlining.
And follow.
And it does have an impact on the wines, and definitely worth trying, even just their entry level stuff. And compare it to someone that's, I guess, a bit more traditional out of Margaret River, and you will notice some difference. Like, I tend to find, in general, their style goes a bit more on the elegant side of things, and I'd say that across the board, like sort of reds and whites. But yeah, just overall quite delicious.
And to be honest, I thoroughly enjoyed all of their wines, but also the fact that they do pick them on certain periods of the moon phases is fantastic. It's so exciting when they show you the map and when they pick it and why. So if you love your horoscopes and your astrology and all that stuff, this is really cool as well in terms of just another fun fact. And probably does make a difference. We don't know. I guess wine has been picked by people for hundreds and hundreds of years. So maybe there is something about that. But anyway, highly suggest having a look at it. I think that brings us to, I guess, a close to today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. In terms of ratings, I'm going to say the Late Harvest was my favourite. I would say, obviously a buy.
Yeah, I think both of us will express our own biases. Like I really like the Skinsey Pinot Gris. Like, I think that's something really different and food versatile. But I like the dessert wine too. Like in the right occasion, I'd happily serve that because for me, like a lot of Aussie dessert wines, I almost call them stickies because they're like, it's just like sugar overload and like, there's flavour, but it's like, it's so sweet and cloying. Like you can only have one glass, whereas you might have noticed like both Dan and myself have been sipping on that throughout the podcast. It's not that cloying. It's got enough acidity to really refresh your palate, which is really important because unfortunately, like a lot of the dessert wines don't fall into that camp. They just fall over and too sweet. But that one's got a good balance.
Yeah, no, can't complain. And to be honest, I did enjoy the Hoddles Creek, so that was also a good one. Probably an accumulate more than anything, but buy for sure the Cullen one. But thank you everyone for tuning in, and we look forward to, I guess, having you listening to the next one in a month's time. So
sounds good.
Thank you. All right.
See you guys.